All right. I think we are live.
This is fun.
It is fun. Um, so how's it going, Matt?
Good. My standing desk is creepily going up, and I had to my chair doesn't also ascend magically, so I had to fake it. Hopefully that looked super magical as it felt for me. But otherwise, yeah, doing great.
Very
How
good.
about you?
I'm good. I'm good. I am well rested. About to go to Toronto tomorrow to talk about automate network automation. So I'm excited about that.
Nice.
I love Toronto. It's about an hour from where I grew up. Um, but I have no family there anymore, so I really don't have a reason to go down there while I'm out there.
Yeah.
Um, but
Are
I'm
you gonna take as you leave the U.S. and go into Canada? Are you gonna take like a canteen of freedom with you so that you have enough to spare?
just in case.
Just free for what do they call it? What does the EPA call it now? Like freedom gas. Take
Freedom,
some freedom gas with you.
some freedom gas. Maybe, yeah, I'll take some American air in a jar so I can breathe in freedom on stage.
Like seriously, go up in front of the audience and be like, "Hold on one second. Okay, all right, I'm good to go." Woo! Lungs are working again.
Liberty. Um, where have you been, man? It's been 2 weeks.
Last week I was in Sun River, Oregon, which is it's pretty cool actually. So there's a river that runs sort of down the middle of the state, along the Cascade Range. If you're not familiar with Cascades, it's like where like Mount Hood and Mount Rainier and Mount Adams, Jefferson, like that whole bit. That's the range up here in the Pacific Northwest. That really where all the mountains are, just running down north south that direction. Anyway, Sun River is alongside the Deschutes River, which is the one of the rivers that runs in the middle of the state, um, which is kind of it's like in the there's a bunch of national forests down there. We were staying at we got an Airbnb out there and basically used that as home base to explore a lot of the rest of the state. Like one of the days we drove south for like 2 hours, I think is what it is from there to Crater Lake. If you haven't been to Crater Lake, it's mind blowingly cool. We haven't gone there yet. We've been living in the Pacific Northwest for like over 4 years, and we haven't been down there yet, just because it's like a 5 hour drive. But driving like what 3 hours to Sun River from Portland is okay, and then resting for a day and kind of hanging around there, and then driving the rest of the way to Crater Lake made it manageable. But anyway, it was just some time off, badly needed apparently. So it was good. It was actually a lot of fun. I didn't take my laptop with me, and everybody's like, "Oh, what do you do? Survive?" It's like, yeah, I survived. I'm not like, you know, physiologically dependent on my laptop, but nevertheless, it is good to leave it behind and be able to focus on the things that you need to focus on. So that's what I did.
Excellent. We had, well, I didn't go on vacation, but we had Brian Linkletter on last week. He wrote the blogs about how to set up self-medicate and how to um, how to what are the basic things involved with making a lesson. Two very well written blogs that are pretty much everything you need to know to do either one of those things. So we had him
Yeah.
on last week. For those who are watching who have not seen last week's stream, definitely check it out. Brian specializes in he has a blog about network simulation, and so he likes NRE Labs and blogs about it. So we also had our first community stand-up meeting for the project last week. Brian, the aforementioned Brian, was there, as well as Overjix. That's his handle on Discord and Discourse. He was there, and we talked a little bit about something that actually this reason why you're on this week. One of the things that came up is, we they how can we get other kinds of nodes in our topologies? And that's
Yeah, I was like watching that. So I came home like late last week, and one of the first things I did was to catch up on the vid because I knew you guys were doing that. So I loaded up the videos from that and started watching the community meeting, the stand up that you guys recorded, and like the whole time I was like, already fixed. Yep, no, that's fixed. No, that'll be fixed. Like Like it's so funny. And we haven't talked about this, so it's kind of funny that like we're all thinking kind of the same things. And then we have these community stand-ups, and we're like, yeah, like looks like we're all on the same page. Like this definitely does need to get fixed.
Nice. Well, yeah. So let's get started then. Um, we have a couple of viewers now. We'll kick it off officially. Welcome to the NRE Labs live stream, our weekly live stream. That is now it's done every single Monday at this time, 10 a.m. Pacific. Goes for 30 minutes to an hour, depends on the topic. We are actually the regular host of the show. I'm Derek Winkworth, known as Cloud Toad on Twitter. Feel free to follow me there, as well as the NRE Labs project at NRE Labs. And this is Matt Oswalt at Mirrodin, Mierdin.
Well done.
Yeah, I remember this time.
Yes, you did.
So we today we're going to actually talk about some of the things that came up in last week's community stand-up. As you know, right now, the way it was built, we can pretty much only support Junos and some Linux hosts for for the endpoints that you can place into your virtual topology for your lesson. And we know this is something that's been top of mind for us for a little while now. It needs to be fixed. There's lots of other things we could be putting in that topology, other network things like maybe Cumulus, maybe FRR, just the open source version of FRR, as well as the ability to generally customize the endpoints that we're putting out there, which is it's a little bit hokey now. If you want to put something specific into the Linux utility thing, then you're just adding more and more stuff to that one image. It'd be nice if there was a way to avoid doing that. And this, I believe, addresses that. So, without further ado, I'm going to actually let Matt talk for a little bit about the changes he made for these exact things.
Yeah. Let me share my screen. So I opened a GitHub issue a couple weeks ago to start to discuss some of the problems that we've had on our mind for a while, actually. Much of this was the thing. Much of what was discussed on that call, we've actually known about for a while. It was just a matter of trade-offs. Like how long can we get away with? How long can we get away with keeping things as they are and keep the project moving forward? And how long do we have until something really really needs to change?
Matt, could you zoom in a little bit?
Oh sure, yeah. How's that?
Beautiful.
So there's a few problems that we want to solve. The first one, and so if you want to follow along under the Syringe issue. So Syringe, if you don't know what Syringe is, it's the backend orchestrator for the Antidote project, and then as a result, NRE Labs. So a lot of whenever we get into like the abstractions that are offered by the Antidote project, more or less what we're talking about is Syringe. Syringe is where a lot of that logic takes place. Now Syringe doesn't have anything to do with how it's presented to you in the browser. That's another sub project of Antidote, but Syringe does take care of allowing you to convert sort of simple text files that describe a lesson into a usable lesson in the browser. So that's why we have the issue here. Now there's a few problems that we have that we want to solve with this effort, and I'll sort of go through them one by one and sort of talk about the history of why we're here, because I think that's important to talk about. The first one is network device configuration is very limited. So right now, when you when you define a lesson, you have a few options. You have an option to declare endpoints within a key within the YAML document called utilities. You also have devices, and then you have black boxes. I think that's it right now. Yeah. So those are the three types. Now there's a few things wrong with that. First off, when it comes to actually making configuration changes, the way it works is Syringe will only perform configuration changes for any endpoints under devices. And there's a bunch of problems with that that we've already articulated in other issues. Actually, Brian brought up a bunch of problems with that. So that's going to get fixed by this effort as well, but they're in a separate issue. The main problem that I'm talking about here is the fact that, let's say everything is working appropriately and there's not really a bug, it's still insufficient because what we did was we said, look, we want this to be multi-vendor, so what we'll do is we'll select Napalm as the sort of mechanism for how to provide configuration. So what you do is you declare an endpoint within that device's key, and then based on the name of the endpoint that you declare, say, VQFX1, what it'll do is it'll look for a configuration file in the lesson directory, in the stage that's being loaded, and then it'll call napalm with that config file and load it onto the device. There's a few things wrong with that. First off, the napalm sort of CLI command that's executed by Syringe statically has the driver set to Junos. And now, before you freak out, that's actually very easy to change. The only reason we did that was because there's only Junos images in the platform right now. So there's not really a point to make that configurable because there's no other images other than Junos right now. But this presents a little bit of a catch-22. So, like, how are we going to get other images contributed if the configuration mechanism is so limited? And I don't mean that it's statically set to Junos. Again, that's easy to fix. We can expose that field into the lesson definition and make it totally, fully configurable. That's very easy. However, what's less easy is the fact that napalm doesn't support everything that we possibly want to configure from a network devices perspective. For instance, Cumulus, as Derek mentioned, is not supported by napalm because there's no like netconf for Cumulus, or at least that's not like the way that they prefer things get configured. There's a very different configuration model if you're working on Cumulus. Same thing is true, by the way, for things like ViOS. So if you're using that, being able to configure things directly via SSH, not screen scraping per se, but editing files and things like that, and config files, that's very useful. And obviously, napalm is not meant to support those things. Napalm is not a configuration management tool. And so, as a result, the network configuration mechanism that's currently in place assumes that that first off, the thing you're trying to configure is a network device, and also on top of that, it has to be supported by napalm, which, as we've mentioned, not all network devices are. Second thing is sort of what I just mentioned. Not all endpoints are network devices, but they require configurations just the same. So take, for instance, if you have what Derek was saying, you have a utility image, which is not a network device. You have some sort of a sort of Linuxy container that's showing an application of some kind or a tool. Maybe you're using Salt or Stackstorm or something like that. And you want to be able to show something different based on the stage that you're in. So you want to be able to say, like, look, I'm moving from stage 1 to stage 2. I need to change the state within this container because it needs to show something different. Or I need to change a config file or something along those lines. Right now, that's literally not even possible. Because, again, what we've done is we've limited the configuration mechanism to napalm. So that means it has to be a network device that you're configuring. So yeah, this is a lot easier to talk about because there's no option here. What you have to do today is you have to bake everything possible into the Docker image ahead of time. Now, I want to be careful here because we're not going away from that. I still believe very strongly that one of the benefits of the platform is a lot of the there's not everything is configured at runtime. One of the great things about immutable infrastructure is there's actual cryptographic mechanisms in place to make sure that the containers start exactly the same way every single time. So we don't want to move away from that. That's very valuable. However, it's nice to be able to say, look, there's some things that we just can't predict ahead of time, or maybe you want to make changes between stages. That's the big thing. The platform doesn't use different images per stage. It uses the same image regardless of the stage that you're in. So being able to make some just-in-time configuration changes is useful. So I would say try to, as we move forward with this new feature that I'm about to talk about, we're still going to try to bake about 90% into the image itself, just to keep things immutable. But that last 10% for things that we really need to change in real time, it's useful to have a mechanism for doing that. So those are the configuration sort of problems that we currently have with the platform. And like I said, we've kind of known that these were going to bite us eventually. It's just been about trade-offs. Right now, we've actually gotten away for a while without solving these problems. We have quite a bit of content already that didn't force us to address this. So like I said, it's not that we for instance, the selected napalm with the Junos driver. We did that just to move things forward, but now it's time to fix it. So that's what we're doing. The third problem is a CLI terminal isn't always the right thing to use to show content. So one of the great things about the platform that we sort of wowed people with early on is that you can use a terminal in the browser. It's really cool, right? Well, and it is, but not everything needs a CLI. Not everything is showable with a CLI. For instance, we want to be able to show things like the Netbox web interface, or the Stackstorm web interface. We have a Stackstorm lesson, but we can only show the CLI, and sometimes it's nice to be able to see the web UI. There's other things, like, for instance, being able to show GUI applications that aren't in the web. Like, for instance, Wireshark runs within, an X environment. So you have to be able to support things like, VNC, potentially. So right now, pretty much the only thing you can show right now is a CLI terminal. And we were tinkering with some of the web resource, aspects of things. There's some capabilities there, but it's just not. It might as well not exist because it wasn't designed properly. So basically, right now, today, the only thing you can do is show some sort of a CLI interface. And as we've mentioned, not everything is most valuable shown that way. So you might need some additional capabilities there. Any other thoughts, Derek, on the problems we're trying to solve before I go into the details of how we did it?
No, I think I'm looking forward to these changes myself. I know some of our community members are, like Overjix, because he figured out that VNC can work. And I myself am kind of looking forward to that. I think it's going to be I think this it's like I said online. I think this is going to open up the field for us in terms of the kinds of lessons we can do. I think there's a lot of stuff out there that we can that we can leverage after these changes.
Yeah, exactly. And the position of the platform is to provide the primitives. I talked about this a lot at Interop, actually. And by the way, if you hadn't seen my talk at Interop, which most people haven't because Interop doesn't show anything, record any of their sessions or historically even allowed recordings. But I talked about that a lot. I basically gave the version of the presentation as the platform might exist in a few months. So I kind of have an idea of the changes we're making in the next few months, and I presented it that way. One of the things I mentioned, and I'll repeat it here, is the job of the platform is to be opinionated, but exactly opinionated enough, but no more. So we provide primitives for showing off content the best way that the lesson authors think it should be provided, while simultaneously making things as easy as possible for them.
Yep.
So that's kind of the goal. So here's how we're going to fix it. So there's two aspects to this effort. There's obviously the configuration portion. So we need to be able to make configuration changes to non-Napalm supported devices, network devices, as well as non-network devices. And so what we need is a new way of performing configurations that allows us to sort of address all of that without reinventing the wheel. The other aspect is presentations. So as I mentioned before, not everything is showable via CLI. Sometimes you might want other mechanisms for showing content. This also, by the way, there's also a thing that some people have requested, is the ability to show the same endpoint in multiple different ways. So right now, the way that you have to define lessons, you can only show the endpoint once. And again, it's very CLI specific. So not only is it CLI specific, but it's also limited in terms of what you can show. For instance, as I mentioned, we have a Stackstorm lesson, and the Stackstorm CLI is a big part of the current lesson. But you might want to show the web UI as well. And right now, the way you would have to do that, and that's if web resources were supported, and they kind of aren't. But even if they were, you would have to spin up two separate endpoints to show that, which is obviously pointless, because if you run a command in one tab, it won't show up as a change in the other tab. So you need to be able to show the same endpoint in multiple ways. So those are the two areas. I'll get into the specifics now, but those are the two areas that we're trying to fix: the way things are configured and the way things are presented. Both of those will be addressed in the same change because of the way that they're conflated today. So let me actually go. Is this that's the new format? Let me actually go out. I'm going to show the curriculum real quick, and I'll show you an example of how this is kind of not ideal today. Oops. It's not where I want to go. I want to go tools. Let's take a look at the JSnappy lesson, for example. So in lesson.meta.yaml, this is the metadata file for describing the JSnappy lesson. This is where, if you haven't looked at this before, basically this is a YAML file that describes the structure of a lesson. Now there's a lot more to a lesson than just this file, for instance, config files and lesson guides and whatnot, but this is where you start. This is what describes the sort of the structure of a lesson. And so as I mentioned, you have a few top level keys here. You have utilities and then you have devices. And again, the way that the backend works is it says, okay, you've defined these 3 endpoints under devices, and then this 1 endpoint under utilities. So what I'm going to do is when you go to stage 1, I'm going to look for 3 text files under the stage 1 directory that's named vqfx1.txt, and then that.txt and that.txt. And that's how these 3 network devices are going to be configured, and it's going to use napalm to do that. Since this is under utilities, I'm not going to do anything with that because utilities don't get automatically configured. So that's currently how it is. And again, that kind of isn't ideal because what if these need to get configured? Let's take a peek at, for instance, let's take a peek at another lesson actually. Let's look at your testing lesson because that's your troubleshooting lesson because that's actually a really good example of the other aspect to this, which is
21.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Which is, I haven't added human readable names to the workflows yet. Oh wait, no, I have. Here we go. There we go. That's another thing I need to fix. I added those directories back there to fix some images problem. That'll get fixed in the new release. So lesson.meta.yaml. This is the troubleshooting lesson that you built. This is actually a really good way of showing the problem because because you're using all of the features. Which shows how I'm conflating things on the back end. So as I mentioned, there's 3 high-level keys. I've shown you utilities and devices. Here's this new one, though, black boxes. The original thought behind this was, okay, maybe you want to show, maybe there's some endpoints that you would like to have in the lesson, but you don't want to show in any way. You don't want to like have them represented within the web UI. You just want them to exist. So for instance, you might have, say, the netbox endpoint here. You need to be able to call the netbox API, but you don't necessarily want to show it in any way in the web browser. You just want the API to be accessible within the lesson.
Yep.
So you spin up an endpoint underneath black boxes, and so Syringe will say, okay, cool, I need to start this container, but I'm not gonna tell the web front end about it. It's just gonna simply exist, and I'll open the ports for it. Now, if you look at this, and you look at the difference between utilities and devices, you'll notice that the difference between those two is pretty simple. Devices get configured and utilities don't. And that's kind of the distinction there. Now, put aside for a second the fact that utilities, you might want to be able to configure these endpoints. Put aside that fact for a moment, even though that's true, it's totally true. You might want to perform configuration tasks on this. That's not actually the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that here, the difference between devices and utilities is a configuration thing. It's the way they're configured. But if you look at the difference between black boxes and devices, that's not the difference at all. The difference there is how they're presented to the front end. And so we have the two axes that I discussed in the issue that I showed you are actually being conflated among these 3 groups of endpoints. Even though all 3 of these endpoints are effectively identical in their fields, they have a name, they have an image reference, and then they have ports. The way that they're treated is very different based on the category that they're in here. And that's not great in terms of how the abstraction is built. It's kind of confusing. So you see, like, I put an endpoint under devices if I want it to be configured, but if I don't want it to be presented, I need to put it under black boxes. But what if I need it to be configured too? Like, it's just very confusing. So here's how we're changing that. I go back to the issue here, issue 112. This is where we're discussing the changes, and I believe this is pretty much identical to how it is today. There might be a small change. I think this field might be a little bit different, but the spirit of it is the same. So forget about the whole utility, devices, black boxes. Like, just forget about that. That's not going to exist anymore in any way. It's just gone. So what we've done instead is in the new version of Syringe, and again, you'll be able to access this. Well, you can actually access this today if you check out my branch and build Syringe yourself. But if you don't want to do that, I'll be, when I merge the PR that does this, I'll be uploading the new Docker image for Syringe, and you can just download it. So if you're not super ambitious, you can just try that. So forget about the whole utilities, devices, black boxes thing. Like, just forget about it. Everything is under endpoints. Every single thing that you put into a lesson is under endpoints. That's this key here. Now let's pick on one of these endpoints. This is going to be pretty similar to what you see today. Let's pick on this one. So VQFX1. A lot of this is going to be familiar. For instance, name is the same. So naming the endpoint, obviously, you want to be able to provide it with a name. Image is exactly the same. That's a Docker, image reference. That hasn't changed. But underneath that is all new stuff. And again, I'm talking about both configuration changes as well as presentation changes in the same breath, because the previous the current abstraction conflates the two. So there's not really a way to solve one problem and then the other. You kind of have to solve both of them together. That's why this is a pretty big change. But I think it's a good change. So underneath each endpoint, so you have in YAML, if you haven't seen this before, you have a list of endpoints. So I'm just going to highlight the endpoint here. This is the endpoint I'm talking about right now. This particular endpoint says configuration, and I think in the current version, it's actually not configuration and then type. It's just one word, configuration type, but it's mostly the same. If you specify napalm after that, what's going to happen is I'm so sorry. I'm probably being overly confusing because napalm is not a supported configuration type. Let me do one better, actually. Sorry, I thought that was going to be a good example, and it's not. I was also fixing some blog issues on my blog. Let me bring up the curriculum here, and I'll bring up the. Oh no, I do have that in GitHub. NRE Labs curriculum. Lessons, fundamentals. Oh, it's in config presentation is where it is. Lesson 1 demo. Okay, sorry about that. So as I mentioned, I created the issue a few weeks ago. So even though the spirit of the change is the same, some of the syntax that's here has changed. So instead of showing you in the issue, I'll show you here in the curriculum that I've been editing to work with the new system. So this is a little easier to look at. So anyway, VQFX1. So sorry about that. This is endpoints, list of endpoints, and then underneath this endpoint are the changes that we have. So as I mentioned, the way that you perform configurations on an endpoint now is with this field that says configuration type. Now it's an optional field. Not everything needs to be configured, as evidenced by the way that we're currently doing things. Like some of the images are just ready to go. You sort of bake all of the things you need into the image, and it's just ready to go. You just need to start it. That's still totally fine. So if you wanted to leave this field out, as you see I'm doing here, see there's no configuration type field here or here. You'll see that it's optional. But if you do provide it, you have two options. You have Python and you have Ansible. So in the case of Python, what happens is similar to how it currently works. What it'll do is it'll say, cool, so I'm loading up this lesson, and you're going to stage 1. So what that means is I'm going to look in the stage 1 directory for a file underneath configs that is named the endpoint name, so VQFX1, .py, because we've selected Python as our configuration mechanism. That Python script is fairly arbitrary. Now, what I've done in this Python script specifically is effectively replicate what we're currently doing statically with the Napalm CLI. So in the previous version of Syringe, what we've done is we basically just shelled out to the Napalm CLI and told it, hey, use this config file and load it onto the device. What I've done is I've replicated that in a Python script and provided that into the curriculum as a Python script. So the same functionality is being done in this particular case. But the cool thing about this is it's all in the Python script. It's not actually baked into Syringe at all. which means that the power of how to configure the network device is fully within the curriculum. There's not like some magic configuration, sort of voodoo baked into Syringe. Syringe is just responsible for figuring out what script to call and calling it. That's it. And so you put all the logic that you need into this script for configuring the device that you want to configure.
Okay, so where does this script run exactly?
This script runs in the same place that the current configuration task runs. And so if you look at...
So like in its own container?
In its own container, totally, yeah. There's actually an image called configurator.
Oh, okay.
That we're already currently using, actually. The difference is if you look at the... if you don't know Go, don't worry about it. I'll explain this, but I'll show you the difference in what we're actually doing. So this is the PR that actually implements these changes. And what I'll do is I'll just go straight to a file called jobs.go and show you the change here. So, yep, here we go. So previously, if you, I'll show you the red text first, because this is what it's currently doing. If you look at the way that Syringe works currently, in order to configure something, what it'll do is it'll spin up a new Kubernetes pod. It actually does it via a job, but it's at the end of the day, it's a pod, which is a container. So it spins up a container. The image that it uses is this special image that we built for doing this called configurator. And basically all that is an image that has a bunch of stuff installed. Python, Ansible, Napalm, all kinds of stuff. Just has it installed. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to call a Python script that's baked into the image called configure.py, which, by the way, is very, very similar to the script I just showed you, with some small changes. And basically what it does is it says, okay, I'm going to configure this device with this config file, and I'm going to configure the host name that's here. So all of this is passed in dynamically. However, the way that it's called is actually very static. As you see, for instance, the driver that we're selecting is Junos. Now again, that's easy to fix. The hard work of selecting Napalm was already done. It's just that we were statically calling Junos because that was the only image we supported. So that's how it's currently done. So basically what we do is we spin up an image called configurator, and we call a script within the configurator image to do the configuration task. Now we're still using the configurator image in the new mechanism because it has all of the things that we need installed by default. So Ansible and Python and Napalm and all that stuff. NetMiko is also installed. So there's all kinds of configuration utilities installed in the configurator. And of course, you can contribute to this if you have a library that you'd like to use. Within reason, we'll absolutely consider adding it to the configurator. We try to treat that a little special because it does affect everyone. But that doesn't mean we're restricting people from contributing to it. You absolutely can do that. Now, the big difference here is instead of calling things, calling a custom script that we wrote within and then we baked into the image, instead what we're doing is we're passing simply the Python command with the Python script in the appropriate directory. So in this line here, if you don't know Go, basically what this does is it creates a string with some replacements. So here it puts the stage that you're currently accessing, so say stage 1. And then it uses the name of the endpoint you're trying to access or configure, .py. And it simply runs that script. That's it. It just runs the script. So there's no opinion there other than I need to run a Python script. And by the way that it knows to run a Python script is if the configuration type field in the lesson definition is set to Python. And that's it. That's really it. So everything, that's all of the opinion that Syringe has. It just calls the script. We also, I'm playing around with Bash. I'm not sure if that's going to make it into this PR. I might take that out temporarily because one of the things we do also support is Ansible. So if you don't want to run a Python script, and a lot of people do have Ansible playbooks for doing configuration changes. So keeping with the spirit of what we want to do for the project, and that is to allow people to reuse content and not reinvent the wheel. A lot of people have Ansible playbooks to do configuration changes already. So rather than force them to write new Python scripts, we also support the use of Ansible playbooks. Same rules apply. If you have an Ansible playbook that you want to use for a particular device, just name it the same as that device and put it in the lesson, the appropriate stage directory within your lesson curriculum.
Nice.
and it'll simply execute it again arbitrarily. So you can put whatever you want inside of that. Take for instance the we'll go back out a directory and look at that particular Ansible playbook. So linux.yml. One of the endpoints is called Linux. And so if you try to move to stage 1, if you load the lesson, it'll look at this directory and say, oh, looks like I have a linux.yml file. So I'm going to try to run that with Ansible and configure the endpoint appropriately. And this is just a BS playbook. It doesn't actually do anything. But the cool thing is we're generating the inventory dynamically. So you just have to say hosts all, and you don't have to worry about where this endpoint is targeting. You just simply run it.
Right. Wow, this is awesome.
Yeah, so it's totally arbitrary. The whole point of this is to remove the black magic from the platform. All of the configuration now is done in the scripts that are in the curriculum. The big difference here is that there's no actual configuration done within the platform. It's actually done within the scripts that the platform calls. So we have a little bit of logic that says, based on what you've stated in the lesson definition, we got to figure out where the appropriate script or playbook is. But once we've done that, the power is back in your hands. You do whatever you need to do within the playbook or within the Python script to do what you need to do to configure any endpoint whatsoever. It doesn't matter if it's a network device. It really doesn't matter at all. You can do whatever you want.
So what are the... Go on.
Go ahead.
So one of the things that somebody had pointed out before was when they use that Linux container, just for that's used almost in every lesson actually.
Yeah.
They see all of the files from all of the lessons in the same directory. Is that like for instance the Python scripts I was building for the troubleshooting thing show up in every single lesson? Is that something that'll be changed, or will that remain the same?
So which scripts are you talking about specifically?
Get phone IP from extension.
And that shows up where? I'm sorry, every single endpoint?
It shows up in every lesson.
Meaning like the whole curriculum directory structure is present.
Yes.
Yes, that's not part of this effort, but that's changing as well.
Okay. Okay, so that's separate.
So yeah, it's actually already merged, I believe. I believe the syringe has already been modified appropriately. But let me try to paraphrase what you just said. If you go to, for instance, like if you load up a lesson, this is how it works today. If you go to labs.networkreliability.engineering and you load up a lesson, and as Derek just said, most lessons have that utility container for showing things like little CLI tools and whatnot. If you go to /antidote within that, I'll just show you. I don't know why I'm talking about it. I can just show you. So let me load the YAML lesson. That'll load pretty quick because it doesn't have any network devices in it. Bring it over here. So if you click this first button in the introduction to YAML, you see what it's doing here. Is it's going into the /antidote/lessons/lesson 14/stage1.
Yep.
Because what happens on the back end is /antidote is actually mapped to the full lesson curriculum in every single case for every container in a lesson. So actually, let's manually go to /antidote and show you what I mean. Oops. So if you look at that, you can see that the entire curriculum, including all of the like travis.yml files, like it's the whole Git repo. It's kind of funny actually. Everything is laid bare to you. Now that has its advantages because you can you can actually just poke around and see what's there, but honestly, you can do that in GitHub. You can clone the same repo yourself. So it's not like this is the only way to see that content. The problem with the way that it currently is it just produces a lot of unnecessary noise. So, and really the biggest way that impacts is the fact that every single lesson has to have this giant CD to path at the very beginning of every lesson. And you might have noticed that we restructured the lesson curriculum to be a little bit more nested and organized. So with that change, it's actually only going to get worse, which is not ideal. So another change that we've made actually is instead of mapping /antidote within the container to the root of the curriculum, meaning the Git repo as a whole, it'll actually map /antidote to the specific lesson directory that's loaded. So Syringe will keep track of where each lesson definition is and use that as the root quote of each lesson. So instead of /antidote being mapped to the root of the curriculum, it'll actually be mapped to, in this case, lessons and lesson 14, which is the YAML lesson. Oops. So if you go to /antidote, obviously this is the old version because we're not on PTR, but if you go to, in the new version of the platform, what you'll see is instead of the full curriculum, when you go to /antidote, you'll just be placed at this lesson directory within this lesson.
Okay.
So it'll be a little more simplified.
Nice.
Now, naturally, if you do want to poke around at the files from other lessons, you're obviously welcome to do so. It's all on GitHub. This is only a runtime optimization.
Okay.
So are we good on configurations?
Yeah, I think so. Yep. I was going to say we should. We have, in the interest of time, we should move on to the other part that you were going to discuss.
Totally, and now that I've laid sort of the framework for the abstraction changes, the second portion of this is actually a little easier to discuss, because as I mentioned, the two aspects to this, endpoint configuration as well as endpoint presentation, are very conflated today, and so we had to solve them kind of both at the same time. So let's go back to your troubleshooting lesson, because again, you use a lot of the features within the platform, so it's a really good way to showcase the changes that we're making. So troubleshoot, there we go. Lesson.meta. All right, so as I mentioned before, we have black boxes, devices, utilities. And these these three things they don't mean the same thing. Like as I mentioned, the difference between devices and utilities is how they're configured. We fixed the configuration aspect of things. But then we have this other thing called the way that things are presented, which is the difference between devices and black boxes, or really utilities and black boxes. The only thing that's different about black boxes is that they're not presented to the front end, so they have no presentation to the front end at all. So instead of having, as I mentioned, we're getting rid of all three of these keywords. They're totally gone. So you could forget about them. In this new version, rather, what we're doing is we are moving to, again, a flat endpoints key. So high level in the lesson, you have endpoints. Okay. And then, as I mentioned, we have this configuration type field. Underneath that, we also have presentations. So every endpoint has a field called presentations, which is also optional. Kind of like how configuration type is optional. Not every endpoint needs to be configured at runtime. Sometimes it's baked into sometimes it's just baked into the image. That's totally fine. Similarly, not every endpoint needs to be presented to the front end. We still want to preserve that functionality. We just want to do it in a way that makes more sense. So in this case, for instance, we have the VQFX1, and we have the sort of canonical presentation format, meaning I want to show a CLI tab to the front end. I'm going to cheat and load something on the back end real quick. One. Oops. One. All right, while that's loading, I'll continue to explain. So presentations, this is the canonical example. I'd like to show a CLI. What you do is you say you name every presentation has a name, and that'll become obvious in a second, but just suffice it to say that we name it CLI for now. You have to provide a port, so every time you want to access the endpoint, you want to tell it what port to access, and then the type of presentation, so SSH. These two fields are very important because what it does is it tells the backend how to access that endpoint. Not only the protocol, but also the port on which that protocol is accessed. And obviously SSH on port 22, fairly common. Now this is cool. It's a syntactic, it's a nice new way of describing how to access this particular endpoint. But I think this new format becomes much more attractive when you consider the use cases that it unlocks. For instance, as I mentioned, there's no need. The presentations field is not required. It's not a required field. You can provide no presentations at all, and what it'll do is it'll just not present that to the front end. And as you can see, we've done that with the InfluxDB endpoint here. So InfluxDB is a time series database. And kind of like in Derek's troubleshooting lesson, we want to be able to show InfluxDB, or we want the InfluxDB API to be available to the other endpoints, but we don't need InfluxDB itself to be shown. We just need it to be reachable. And so we declare it underneath endpoints. We simply don't pass any presentations underneath it, and it's there. Now, there's one thing that I want to call out here. If you specify presentations, what it'll do is when you specify the port that presentation is accessible over, port 22, Syringe will do all the magic on the back end to instruct Kubernetes to open that port. If you don't have any presentations, you're still going to want a port open, so you need to provide that in this additional ports field. So if you don't have any presentations, or even if you do have presentations but you want additional ports opened, you can provide that as a list here, and Syringe will open those ports for you. So just keep that in mind. Any port you mentioned here is opened automatically, but if you want additional ports opened, you use the additional ports field. Also cool, but I think the real value is in what I'm about to show. If you go to the Linux endpoint, for instance, as I mentioned, it might be useful to show the same endpoint multiple times. So you might have noticed that the presentations field, the key presentations, has a value, and that value is actually a list. So it's not a single presentation. You can provide multiple presentations. And what's going to happen is it's going to pass both of those presentations up to the front end. Now, those two presentations are connecting to the same image, this same Linux endpoint. But it's showing them in two different ways, and those two presentations are named CLI1 and CLI2. Hopefully this is loaded by now. Ooh, it's not. Okay. That's okay. I don't know what the deal is there. I haven't touched PTR since I came back from PTO, so who knows? Anyway, what's going to happen is, and I do have screenshots that I can show. If you see these two presentations, those two presentations will be made available as two different tabs. So let's actually go back to the issue, and I'll show you the screenshots of this in progress. So if you look, these two, that's horrible. If you see these two, this screenshot here, you can see that it has multiple tabs to the same resource. So Linux is the name of the endpoint. If there are multiple presentations for an endpoint, the web front end is going to disambiguate those two presentations with the name of the presentation itself. So CLI in this case, and in the other tab, CLI2. Two different presentations, two different tabs to the exact same endpoint. That's pretty cool. The other aspect of this is not only SSH is supported, so you don't have to say like two tabs with SSH. It might be useful to show an HTTP resource. And as you can see, the only difference, there's really only one difference with the way that that's shown, and instead of using type SSH, you say type HTTP. Still have to provide a port, and obviously this image has to be offering some web content. It has to be running some sort of a web server, obviously, in this case over port 5000. But that's what we're doing. So if you look at the screenshot for that, you can see we have a little self-service portal I built, and it's shown just like any other tab in the web UI here. Now the cool thing about this is it's shown alongside the rest of the lesson content. So instead of having to open a new tab to a new resource, it's contained within its own tab that you can toggle back and forth from. And again, if you wanted to provide, say, this presentation to an endpoint and then have a second presentation, but instead of using HTTP, you can use CLI, that's also supported. So not only do you have the ability to have multiple presentations, but each presentation doesn't have to use the same type. You can have one be HTTP and have the other be SSH. Not sure. I don't think this is going to be supported initially, but because of this framework, the next logical step is to not only support those two presentation types, but also to support VNC.
Nice.
Which is on the roadmap now. The reason we're probably not going to get that done for this release is it's not a simple matter of exposing the field and the abstraction. There's actually more work to do than that. The terminal functionality right now is being offered over Guacamole, and the HTTP functionality is not offered over Guacamole. That's done directly via Kubernetes ingresses. And so that was actually much more easy to add. The VNC functionality will actually also be offered over Guacamole, but right now the Guacamole front end, or really the servlet, is statically using SSH. So there's more changes that are needed there. This particular effort is meant to focus on the abstraction for syringe. So once the abstraction is appropriate, and there will be a place to place the VNC field, the sort of the VNC specification, then we'll go turn our attention to the servlet and make sure that it supports VNC. Once it does, we'll light up that feature within the abstraction, and that way you'll have 3 options instead of 2.
It sounds good.
Looks like I have one more screenshot. This kind of shows back to the configuration portion of this instead of we were talking about presentation for a while there, but back to the configuration portion, you can see that we're spinning up config pods for both the Linux endpoint as well as a VQFX endpoint. Yep. That's sort of what you'll see now. If you poke around and self-medicate, you'll see stuff like this too. It used to be that you would only see config for like network endpoints like VQFX, and that'd be it. That'd be all you saw. Now you're going to see a config endpoint for any endpoint, or a config pod for any endpoint you specify a configuration type for.
So another thing that came up is that, and I think I'm looking at this, what I'm about to talk about right below that, that issue in 113 will this allow Multus to configure multiple net and interconnect Linux hosts?
Yeah, that's. I think I mentioned this in this issue. So the original concern was that only network devices were able to spin up. Basically, that Syringe didn't allow connections to non-network devices. That was the original concern, and I that was very concerning to me because I didn't think that was the case. So I did go back and forth a little bit with Brian. It was a very good discussion because what I discovered was, while connections to non-network devices absolutely is supported, the way that I was spinning them up was not ideal. So if you look at, I think I linked to it. Yeah, here we go. So in this answer, I illuminate the problem. In Syringe, in the current version, what it'll do is it'll say, only if there are devices in the lesson will I create connections. So it's a small distinction, but an important one. Connections, Multus doesn't care what's running in the container, like at all. It doesn't matter if it's running a network device or not. It doesn't have any way of knowing that, right, actually. So that's not the problem. It's not that Multus can't support network devices. It can work with any pod that we spin up. The problem was in the current version of Syringe, and this is also getting fixed in this new PR. What the logic here is, if there are devices in the lesson definition, then I will create all of the connections. And in Brian's case, he actually didn't have any network devices at all. What he was trying to do was spin up connections to nothing but, again, utility endpoints, which, again, I'm trying not to use that terminology because it's going away, but basically non-network devices. So technically it's supported, but because of this logic, those connections didn't, like Syringe didn't even try to create those connections because of this little conditional in here, where it says only if there are devices in the lesson. So yeah, that's actually an easy fix. I just got rid of this conditional. To be honest, I'm not sure why it was in there ever. I'm not sure why it was ever in there. I'm sure I had a good reason at the time, but clearly I don't anymore. So in the new PR that's going to solve all these changes, it's going to implement all these changes, that conditional is no longer there. And any connection that you put into place will be put into place at runtime. So this, yeah, that'll get squashed.
Huh. Wow. So this is there's a bunch of that. This is a lot of very significant changes that greatly enhance the functionality of the platform.
I think so. I think it's certainly a step in the right direction. I'm mostly excited about the HTTP functionality because if you've paid attention, this is actually currently supported, but I just don't talk about it because the way that it's configured is pretty bad. The way that you show iframes within, like a lesson resource is actually pretty gross. And I've known that. I've been playing with the idea for a while, but it just hasn't worked well. I feel a lot better about this, the way that this is done, and so I feel a lot better. And we're gonna be using this. Like, we have a bunch of lessons that need to use this functionality. So we're gonna be right out of the gate, pretty much as soon as this functionality is merged into Syringe. I'm going to be turning my attention to a few of the lessons that I've kind of kept on the back burner, waiting for this functionality to be here. and I'm going to use those as a way of sort of showing off this functionality. There's a lot of people that I've talked to that want to build lessons. For instance, there's some folks that want to build stuff around time series databases and visualization. You can't do that with a CLI. You need to be able to show something in a web resource. So I'm pretty excited about that. And then of course the configuration change. I mean, that's huge, right? Like not only supporting non-napalm devices, but frankly being able to configure anything you want in an arbitrary way. Yeah, it's going to unlock, I think, a lot. Again, previously we kind of had a chicken and egg problem. It's like, look, we haven't had a need for this yet because we've got a lot of stuff to do, and right now it kind of works, and that's true. But we're getting to the point now where it's like, okay, we've kept this technical debt on the books for so long. Now we got to start paying it off, and that's what this effort's meant to do. It's meant to be the culmination of that initial trade-off with actually addressing the problem long term.
Nice. Nice. Yeah, I'm excited. I think this will actually make it easier for me to actually finish that troubleshooting lesson, and actually multiple other workflow lessons that there's multiple ideas we've been talking about. And this will make it a lot easier to get those done. And I think
Yeah,
the workflow lessons are really going to end up being the meat of the matter on this site, where people can actually see, something tangible right away, that does something for them, and like in that workflow lesson, that's tied to all the fundamentals. And having this means I mean, there's so many things we can do now once this is complete. So when should we expect to see at least some of these initial changes being checked in, like uh, and made official?
yeah. Well, the that's a good question. So the functionality actually is there. If you I got to figure out what's going on with PTR, but I've tested a lot of the functionality already, and it's there. I have a few things I want to do before I merge it. So, and then of course I've got other things I need to do. Like for those that have been looking at some of the activity and some of our operational repos, you might notice that we're doing a lot of infrastructure changes, or at least planning them. One of those is moving to a bare metal as a service provider, which is going to be awesome from a performance perspective. Also, a very needed change. So that's another one of the big projects on my plate. Nevertheless, the functionality for this change does already exist. I just need to sort of check a few T's and cross a few T's and dot a few I's. I would expect, ideally by the end of the week, although I will say that's sort of a stretch goal. Worst case scenario within the next 2 weeks.
Nice.
As you mentioned, this is a very big change. So I do want to make sure that it's properly tested and baked, and I gotta clean up some of the things that I was building originally that I sort of tabled. So mostly cleanup tasks. The bulk of the work is done, but because of the sort of the vastness of this change, I want to be sensitive to how it's implemented. So I'm going to take my time on this one. But suffice it to say, within the next 2 weeks.
All right. Okay. Well, I think we're gonna wrap up. We're at the top of the hour. Um, and doesn't well, at least Twitch is telling me we don't have any viewers, so we're gonna close out. Um, thank you for
You're not
watching.
supposed to say that, man. We have thousands of viewers.
Yeah, well, right now I don't know. I'm not sure how Twitch is never accurate, to be honest, with how they report that. Um, thank you for watching. And I hope you're as excited as we are about the changes we talked about today. They're coming soon, and they should definitely enable you as a lesson creator to do some just amazing things. So um, please join us tomorrow for our community stand-up call. It's at 8 a.m. Pacific. We do it at that time because we have multiple community members over in Europe, and that this is a balance between beginning of the day and the end of the day, and everyone in between, such as myself. So please join us. The details for that are uh, on our forum site, community.networkreliability.engineering. It's so head over there if you want to see just click on that invite link at 8 a.m. tomorrow, and you should be able to join the stand-up call. So once again, I'm Derek Winkworth, aka Cloud Toad on Twitter, and this is Matt, our co-host and and technical genius behind this. Really, all of the coding behind this project. He is at Mirrodin, Mierdin. Please follow him as well, and follow us. Follow the official project account at NRE Labs. Thanks again. Anything you want to say, Matt?
Thanks for listening to me babble for an hour.
It was fun. It's always fun hearing you talk. So, all right. Talk to you later.
All right.